This video is brought to you by pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all kinds of great Canadian products made by Canadian creators. Enjoy!
In the spring of 1769, Henry embarked on a prospecting expedition to the island of Michipicoten, located about 37 miles southwest of the mouth of the Michipicoten River. When he failed to find any interesting minerals there, he planned to paddle south to a smaller island in the middle of Lake Superior, known as Caribou Island, which the Indians tantalizingly claimed had beaches of yellow sand. The Indians hadn't visited the island personally, but knew about its existence from the tales passed down by their ancestors, which also contended that the island was home to enormous snakes. Unfortunately, Henry was unable to make the journey on account of poor weather and was obliged to return to the fort. In the spring of 1771, Alexander Henry partnered up with Alexander Baxter and formed a mining company, as they had previously planned. The two Alexanders built a barge at Pointe-à-Pas, a peninsula on the northwestern shore of Lake Erie, and embarked for the island of Yellow Sand, supposedly by the Indians to lie south of the island of Michipicoten, hoping that its beaches were littered with gold dust. After a search of 2 days, Henry wrote, "We discovered the island with our glass, and on the third morning, the weather being fair, steered for it at an early hour. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we disembarked upon the beach." Unquote. Henry carried his gun onto the island, resolved to bravely fight off the giant snakes the Indians claimed inhabited its shores. As the beach he landed on did not have golden sand, however, he thought that he had little to fear, as he presumed that the snakes were the guardians of the gold. Henry spent that day and the next hunting caribou in the island's woods and managed to kill 5 large animals. On the third day, he and Baxter explored the rest of the island, but failed to find its legendary golden shores or its giant serpentine guardians. Instead, they were hounded by a profusion of angry hawks, one of which snatched Henry's cap from his head. On the 4th day, Henry, Baxter, and their employees sailed for Nanaboju Island. There, they discovered veins of silver-tinged copper and lead, which they began to mine and smelt. When they concluded their prospecting on Nanaboju Island, the mining company met up with a Russian mineralogist named Mr. Norberg and conducted another prospecting expedition, this one on the southeastern shores of Lake Superior. There they found blue semi-transparent stones, which was later found to be 60% silver by weight. The prospectors then parted company with Mr. Norberg and headed west to Ontonagon. There, they set up a mining camp and began to extract the local copper, hoping that it might contain silver. The miners labored throughout the winter of 1771, but abandoned the operation in the spring of 1772 when their tunnel collapsed. In August 1772, Henry and Company established a mining camp on the northern shores of Lake Superior. There, the company employees mined copper, which was later sent to Montreal. The company dissolved in 1774 when it was determined that the mining profits did not justify the cost of the operation. In the summer of 1775, Alexander Henry decided to take up trading once again. He purchased 3,000 pounds sterling's worth of provision, bought 4 large canoes and 12 smaller ones, and hired a crew of 51 French-Canadian voyagers. On June 10, he and his men left Sault Ste. Marie for the northwestern shores of Lake Superior. They passed a large hollow rock called the Otter's Head and camped at the mouth of the Pic River. They visited Pic Island and paddled past the Pepla, or flat land, a flat wooded shore between 2 mountains where the French had once operated a trading post. Finally, the voyagers reached the so-called Grand Portage, located on the western end of Lake Superior, southwest of the present-day city of Thunder Bay, Ontario. There, he and his men hauled their canoes and provisions overland to the Pigeon River, the lower 21 miles of which were unnavigable due to rapids and waterfalls. They proceeded up the Pigeon River, portaged around what were known today as the High Falls, and entered what Henry called the Hauteur de Terre, or Land's Height, a wooded, lake-ridden highland. There, they followed a chain of lakes and rivers to Saginaga Lake, once the site of an Ojibwa village, and further northwest to Rainy Lake. They continued up the Rainy River to the Lake of the Woods. There, Henry and his men found an Indian village of several hundred residents. The village chiefs welcomed the traders cordially with gifts and speeches. In return, Henry gave the natives a present consisting of a 60-pound keg of gunpowder, 80-pound bags of shot and additional gunpowder, and a keg of rum. After purchasing wild rice from the Indians, Henry and his crew paddled across the Lake of the Woods and portaged to the Winnipeg River. The voyagers continued down the Winnipeg River, portaging around its more turbulent sections. They headed down a scenic branch of the river called the Pinawa Channel and encamped at the head of a portage trail called the Carrying Place of the Lost Child. Here, Henry wrote, is a chasm in the rock, nowhere more than 2 yards in breadth, but of great and immeasurable depth. The Indians relate that many ages past a child fell into this chasm, from the bottom of which it is still heard at times to cry, unquote. At the entrance to Lake Winnipeg, the voyagers came upon a village of Cree Indians. Henry wrote that the Cree were very different in appearance and custom from the Ojibwa, and remarked that a few Cree men lent some of their wives, of which they had several, to some of his voyagers, asking that they return them in a year's time. On August 18, 1775, Henry and his men left the Cree camp and paddled up the lake's eastern shore. They soon met and were joined by Peter Pond, a gruff soldier, adventurer, and fur trader famous for his violent temper. The following day, they were beset by a storm which killed 4 men and destroyed 1 canoe. On August 21st, the voyagers paddled across Lake Winnipeg to its southern shore. There, several weeks later, they encountered brothers Joseph and Thomas Frobisher, fur traders and distant relatives of the famous Elizabethan explorer Sir Martin Frobisher. In early autumn, the explorers were in desperate need of food. Spurred by the fear of starvation, they proceeded up the Saskatchewan River. They tracked and portaged up around the Grand Rapids and entered Cedar Lake. They crossed the lake and continued up the Saskatchewan River, in which they caught several large sturgeon and killed a huge number of wild fowl. 80 leagues upriver from the ruins of an old French fur trading post called Fort Bourba, Henry and his men came to another old trading post called Fort Pascoya, around which revolved a Cree village. There, the village chief, a tall, chubby, sly-looking warrior named Pelican, invited the Europeans to a council in his teepee. Pelican informed the travelers that he would allow them to continue up the Saskatchewan River only if they gave him a present consisting of 3 casks of gunpowder, 4 bags of shot, 2 bales of tobacco, 3 kegs of rum, and some knives. Left with little alternative, the voyagers complied with the demand and continued up the river. Shortly after their departure, they were overtaken by Chief Pelican himself, who had pursued them alone in a canoe. The daring chief boarded one of their canoes with a spear in his hand and demanded another keg of rum. Knowing there could be serious consequences if they killed the chief, the voyagers granted Pelican's request and parted ways with him. On October 26th, the adventurers reached Cumberland House, a Hudson's Bay Company fort built the year prior on the shores of Cumberland Lake by English explorer Samuel Hearne. Although the great explorer himself was absent at the time, the fort was occupied by Highlanders from the Orkney Islands, who treated Henry and his men with hospitality. There, Henry's party fractured into several different groups, each of which headed to a separate fort in the region. Henry and the Frobisher brothers, along with 40 of their employees, remained together and decided to make for what is known today as Amisk Lake. Henry and company paddled their canoes across Cumberland Lake and up the Sturgeon Weir River, battling rapids all the way. They continued to Amisk Lake just as the water began to freeze. There, the party split into 3 groups, 2 of which were tasked with ice fishing, and the third of which was given the job of constructing a fort on the lake's shore. 10 days later, the voyagers completed the construction of what is known today as Frobisher Henry Fort. Henry and his men spent the winter fishing and hunting on Amisk Lake, subsisting on trout and elk. On January 1st, 1776, Alexander Henry decided to visit the westernly prairies, accompanied by 2 French Canadians. Henry snowshoed to Cumberland House, struggling through deep snow and suffering bitterly cold temperatures. In addition to his 2 employees, Henry was accompanied on his first leg of the journey by Joseph Frobisher, whom he wrote in gratitude, is certainly the first man that ever went the same distance in such a climate upon snowshoes to convey a friend. Henry and his men snowshoed across Cumberland Lake and continued up the Saskatchewan River. The temperature was so cold that the explorers were obliged to sleep huddled together on the same buffalo robe. When the travelers ran out of provisions, Henry produced a bar of chocolate that he had saved for such an occasion. The men gradually consumed the confection by dissolving a square at a time onto a pot of hot water and drinking the liquid. They subsisted on this weak hot chocolate for several days, nearly succumbing to starvation, when they stumbled upon the bones of an elk recently devoured by wolves. Having instantly gathered them, Henry wrote, we encamped, and filling our kettle, prepared ourselves a meal of strong and excellent soup. The greater part of the night was passed in boiling and regaling on our booty, and early in the morning we felt ourselves strong enough to proceed." Unquote. On January 25th, Henry and his men reached the edge of the Canadian prairies. There, they found the whole frozen carcass of a red deer, which appeared to have become stuck in the river ice on the onset of winter. The adventurers removed as much meat from the carcass as they could, and enjoyed the first good meal since the Cumberland House. On the morning of January 27th, Henry and his men came upon a pair of day-old snowshoe tracks. They followed the tracks and arrived at a fur trading post called Fort des Prairies, also known as Fort de la Corne. That evening there, the fort's occupants treated Henry and his employees to a bountiful feast of buffalo bull tongues. A band of Assiniboine Indians were also visiting Fort de la Corne at the time, hoping to more thoroughly experience the prairies and perhaps see the Rocky Mountains beyond. Henry asked the Assiniboine if he might accompany them to their village. The natives agreed, and thus Henry, along with his 2 French-Canadian employees and 2 English fur traders named Patterson and Holmes, set out with their new native companions in early February. The Europeans followed the Indians up to a high plateau, where trees were sparse. They struggled to keep up with the natives, who wore narrower snowshoes than them, and who had loaded much of their supplies onto dog-drawn travois. They stopped and made camp at sunset. "The tent in which I slept," Henry wrote, contained 14 persons, each of whom lay with his feet to the fire, which was in the middle, but the night was so cold that even this precaution, with the assistance of our buffalo robes, was insufficient to keep us warm. Our supper was made on the tongues of the wild ox, or buffalo, boiled in my kettle, which was the only one in camp." Unquote. The following day, Henry and his companions followed the Indians across the open prairie. When a snowstorm threatened to descend upon them, they took shelter in a small isolated copse of trees and shrubs, the trunk of the largest which did not exceed a man's wrist in diameter. The party resumed their journey the next day, finally making camp on the shores of a frozen lake. There, they were approached by scouts sent by Great Road, the head chief of the Assiniboine, who had sent them to search for the band, worried that something might have befallen the travelers on their journey to the east. The scouts were pleased to find Henry and his companions along with the Assiniboine, telling them that their chief would be interested in meeting them. The travelers and the scouts spent the next few days encamped beside the lake, where they waited out a storm that nearly buried their teepees in snow. At the height of the blizzard, the wooded oasis was invaded by a herd of buffalo which might have trampled the camp had it not been for the barking of the Indian dogs and the shooting of the Assiniboine hunters, the latter killing any animal which ventured too close to their teepees with bows and arrows. Whatever were the terrors which filled the wood, Henry wrote, the buffalo had no other escape from the terrors of the storm. When the storm finally abated, the scouts set out for camp of Great Road, bearing gifts of tobacco and vermilion, with which Europeans had supplied them. The rest of the travelers followed more slowly, burdened by their equipment and provisions. The travelers reached the camp of Great Road on the morning of February 11th, 1776. Henry and his men were greeted by an honored guard, whose members ushered them into a tent which had been set aside for their use. There, Assiniboine women presented them with warm water for washing. The refreshment was exceedingly acceptable, Henry wrote, for on our march we had become so dirty that our complexions were not very distinguishable from those of the Indians themselves. Following their ablutions, the Europeans were taken to Great Road's tent. Henry described the great Assiniboine chief as standing about 5'10" and having a darker complexion than most of his fellow tribesmen. Great Road's most peculiar physical attribute was his hair, which he wore in long, wild, matted dreadlocks. Henry learned that the chief never cut or groomed in accordance with a peculiar Samsonesque superstition he had. Great Road believed that his hair was the source of his fortune and power. When the guests entered his teepee, the head chief shook each of their hands and invited them to sit on the bearskins which had been spread on the ground. Great Road then produced a pipe which everyone in attendance proceeded to smoke. The chief then made a long and eloquent speech, following which every Indian in the teepee began to weep. Henry was told later that the Indians practiced this custom in honor of their deceased relatives, memories of whom invariably surfaced at the commencement of feasts and ceremonies. The weeping continued for 10 minutes, and when it ended, the Indians feasted their guests on boiled buffalo tongue. Henry and his companions were invited to a second feast later that night, in which all the Assiniboine men, due to the warmth of the fire, stripped entirely naked, to some of the white men's amusement. The following day, after Henry and his companions toured the village, Great Road delivered another speech in which he informed the Europeans that he was at their service and that he planned to visit Fort de la Corne at the earliest opportunity. He then gave his guests a gift of beaver pelts and wolf furs, prompting the travelers to present him with more tobacco and vermilion. Henry and his companions spent 5 more days in the camp of the Assiniboine. Although they had liberty to go about the camp as they pleased, they were guarded at all times by 6 warriors who savagely thrashed anyone who came too close to them. During their stay, the Assiniboine invited the Europeans to accompany them on a buffalo hunt. Henry described how the Assiniboine had built a fence or buffalo pound about 5 miles from the camp many years ago. The V-shaped enclosure consisted of birch stakes throughout which smaller branches were woven. Once the pond was sufficiently repaired, a handful of Assiniboine hunters donned buffalo robes with horns. Their faces were covered, Henry wrote, and their gestures so closely resembled those of animals themselves that I had not been in secret I should have been so much as deceived as the oxen. Unquote. These special hunters spent most of the evening luring the buffalo towards the pound, successfully convincing their quarry that they were bison calves by mimicking their sounds and behavior. Slowly but steadily, the hunters lured the buffalo herd into the enclosure, finally slipping out of the pound through a hidden gate at its end. The rest of the warriors, meanwhile, concealed themselves behind the pound walls. On a prearranged signal, hunters emerged from their hiding places and began to shower the buffalo with arrows. Whenever any of the animals attempted to escape the pound, a hunter would wave a buffalo robe in its face, prompting the creature to scramble backwards. The morning following the slaughter, the carcasses were processed, the tongues, hearts, and shoulders being set aside for feasts, and the remainder dried for future use, and for sale at the Fort de la Corne. The Assiniboine spent the rest of the day and much of the night feasting, dancing, singing, and making music. The musical instruments, Henry wrote, consisted principally in a sort of tambourine and gourd filling with stones, which several persons accompanied by shaking 2 bones together, and others with bunches of deer hooves, fastened to the end of a stick. Another instrument was one that was no more than a piece of wood of 3 feet with notches cut on its edge. The performer drew a stick backward and forward along the notches, keeping time. The woman sang, and the sweetness of their voices exceeded whatever I had heard before. On the morning of February 20th, the Assiniboine broke camp and, accompanied by Henry and his companions, set out for Fort de la Corne. They arrived at the fort on the evening of February 28th, having stopped at another Assiniboine village in the middle of their journey, and convinced its inhabitants to similarly pay a visit to the French-turned English fur-trading fort. There, Great Roads' warriors exchanged dried meat and furs for European trinkets. The Assiniboines spent 4 days at the fort, whereupon they parted amicably with Henry and the other traders, apparently satisfied with their reception. Henry himself left the fort on March 22nd and returned to Amisk Lake. There, Henry and the fort's occupants spent the next 2 months fishing and hunting fowl. On May 21st, Alexander Henry, Joseph Frobisher, and 40 French-Canadian voyageurs set out for the northerly Churchill River, which empties into Hudson Bay. They reached their destination with little difficulty and met up with Thomas Frobisher, who had made the same journey earlier. Together, the party traveled up the Churchill River, hoping to meet with a band of Chippewayan Indians who had traveled all the way from Lake Athabasca, with whom Thomas Frobisher had scheduled a rendezvous. The Europeans met with the natives upriver as prearranged. After exchanging gifts, the traders asked the Chippewayans to accompany them to Amisk Lake. The Indians acquiesced, and the party made the return journey without incident, accompanied by their new native friends. At Frobisher Henry Fort, the Chippewayans traded fur for rum, diluted at their own request, and for guns, ammunition, blankets, hatchets, and other European goods. Throughout the course of their transactions, the natives told the Europeans about Peace River Country, the Pacific Ocean west of the Rocky Mountains, and of the Slave River which empties into the Great Slave Lake. Once their business was concluded, the Chippewyans set out on their return journey to Lake Athabasca, accompanied by Thomas Frobisher. Alexander Henry, on the other hand, decided to return to the Grand Portage on the western shores of Lake Superior. All throughout the journey, Henry and his traveling companions met with Indians who informed them that strange white men from the southeast had killed all the Englishmen in Montreal and Quebec and would soon occupy the Great Lakes. Henry correctly suspected, and later learned definitively, that these were exaggerated tidings of the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. Although Alexander Henry the Elder's memoirs end with his return to the Grand Portage, this point does not mark the end of his adventures. In the fall of 1776, Henry sailed to England, where he visited the London headquarters of the Hudson Bay Company and proposed that the Great British Fur Trading Syndicate make a practice of hiring the French-Canadian voyageurs of the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes. That accomplished, he proceeded to Versailles, France, where he gained audience with the French Queen, Marie Antoinette. Alexander Henry returned to British North America in the spring of 1777 and thrust himself back into the fur trade, conducting most of his business on the Great Lakes. He returned to England twice more, in 1778 and in 1780, before finally settling in Montreal, where he established himself as a merchant. Throughout the 1780s, he had 5 children with a wealthy English widow named Julia Kitson, whom he eventually married in the summer of 1785. In February of that year, Alexander Henry and 18 fellow English fur traders who had cut their teeth in the Great Lakes and the Northwest beyond, including the Frobisher brothers, Peter Pond, and other friends Henry had made during his travels, established a gentlemen's club called the Beaver Club. These gentlemen frontiersmen established a tradition of meeting at one another's homes or hotels or taverns in Montreal for very peculiar dinners. Dressed in their finest clothes, club members would initiate the evening's festivities by passing around a peace pipe in the Indian style, as every one of them had done around the countless campfires during their adventures in Canadian wilds. When the ritual was complete, the frontiersmen would sit down to a feast of country fare, the menu including courses such as pemmican, venison, buffalo tongue, whitefish, and wild rice, all prepared in European style and served with the finest crystal and silverware. When the meal was finished, the participants would spend the rest of the night drinking, smoking, dancing, singing old Voyager songs, and regaling each other with tales of their exploits and adventures during their fur trading days. Prompted by financial difficulties, Alexander Henry returned to the fur trade in the spring of 1786 and remained in business until 1790. In the 1790s, Henry played a role in organizing Northwest Company fur shipments to China. Alexander Henry spent the rest of his days in Montreal, enjoying a place in high society and remaining an active and enthusiastic member of the Beaver Club. He spent his time engaging in various business ventures, serving as a captain in the Canadian militia and working as a justice of peace. In a private letter to a friend, penned in 1809, he lamented the changing spirit of the Canadian fur trade, writing, "There is only us 4 old friends alive. All the northwestwards are parcel of boys and upstarts who were not born in our time, and supposes they know much more of the Indian trade than any before him." On April 4th, 1824, 85-year-old Alexander Henry the Elder passed away in his home in Montreal, leaving behind 5 children, an entertaining and historically invaluable memoir, and a place in history as one of the first pedlars, or English coureurs de bois, to resume the Great Lakes and northwestern fur trade in the wake of the British conquest of New France.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check out our website, pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all sorts of great Canadian products.